London, 1872. The city was a living paradox, its streets teeming with the promise of progress, yet shadowed by secrets that festered in the fog. Gas lamps flickered along the cobblestone roads, their pale light barely piercing the thick, coal-stained air. The Thames, swollen and sluggish, carried whispers of industry and decay through the heart of the metropolis. In the wealthier districts, carriages rattled past grand townhouses, their windows aglow with the warmth of family and fortune. But in the East End, where the city's pulse beat with a feverish desperation, the night belonged to the lost, and the damned. It was here, on the edge of Whitechapel, that St. Cecilia's boarding school for girls stood, a 4-story edifice of soot-blackened brick and iron, its Gothic spires clawing at the sky. The school's reputation was as formidable as its architecture. Founded in 1848 by the enigmatic Reverend Dr. Archibald Blackwood, St. Cecilia's promised salvation for the daughters of London's troubled elite. A sanctuary for the wayward, a forge for the future, proclaimed the brass plaque at its wrought iron gates. But behind those gates, the air was thick with more than incense and discipline. There was a chill that seemed to seep from the very stones, a sense of watchfulness that made even the bravest girls shiver as they crossed the threshold. The school's facade was immaculate. Tall, arched windows gleamed in the morning sun, and the gardens were kept in strict order by the silent, stooped gardener, Mr. Pritchard. Ivy curled up the walls, its green tendrils a rare softness against the hard lines of the building. The bell tower, visible for miles, tolled with mechanical precision, marking the hours of prayer, study, and sleep. To the outside world, St. Cecilia's was a beacon of Victorian virtue, a place where troubled girls were reformed into proper ladies ready to take their place in society. But the girls who lived within its walls knew better. They whispered of the night sisters, who glided through the dormitories after midnight, faces hidden beneath starched white veils. They spoke of the locked doors in the East Wing, behind which no student had ever set foot. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving in the chapel long after the candles had been snuffed. Others swore they heard weeping from the old laundry, where the walls were thick and the windows bricked over. The bravest among them dared each other to sneak into the forbidden cellars, but none ever returned with proof-only wide eyes and trembling hands. The school's rules were strict, enforced by a staff of severe women in black bombazine dresses. Silence was demanded at meals, prayers recited at dawn and dusk, and every infraction was met with swift, mysterious punishment. The headmistress, Miss Agatha Grimshaw, was a figure of legend, her hair always pulled tight beneath a lace cap, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She moved through the halls with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Her office, lined with leather-bound volumes and smelling faintly of lavender and ink, was a place of both judgment and mercy. Or so the girls hoped, yet for all its discipline, St. Cecilia's was a place of contradictions. The curriculum was rigorous Latin, mathematics, music, and scripture, but the girls were often left to their own devices for hours at a time. The staff, though ever present, seemed to watch more than they spoke, their eyes lingering on certain students with an intensity that was hard to ignore. The school's benefactors, a shadowy board of trustees, visited only at night, their carriages arriving in silence and departing before dawn. No one knew their names, only that their presence meant new rules, new faces, and sometimes the sudden disappearance of a student. On this particular autumn evening, as the sun bled red behind the city's jagged rooftops, a new arrival stood at the gates. Eleanor Whitcombe, age 16, clutched her battered valise and stared up at the looming school. Her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and defiance. She had been sent here after a scandal too great for her family to bear. Secret whispered behind gloved hands and closed doors. Her father, a minor baronet with more debts than friends, had delivered her to St. Cecilia's with a single cold command: "You will not shame us again." Eleanor's first impression was of silence and unnatural, heavy quiet that pressed against her ears. The only sound was the distant tolling of the bell and the soft crunch of gravel beneath her boots. The gates creaked open, and she was greeted by Miss Grimshaw herself, who regarded her with a gaze that seemed to weigh her soul. "Welcome to St. Cecilia's, Miss Whitcombe," the headmistress intoned. "You will find that we value obedience above all else. Come, the others are waiting." As Eleanor followed Miss Grimshaw through the shadowed halls, she caught glimpses of other girls' pale faces peering from behind doors, whispers that died as she passed. The air was thick with secrets, and the walls seemed to lean in, listening. In the great hall, portraits of past headmistresses glared down from the walls, their painted eyes following every movement. The ceiling soared overhead, lost in shadow, and the long tables were set for supper, though no one spoke above a whisper. That night, as Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, the wind howled against the windows, and the old building creaked and groaned. She stared at the ceiling, heart racing, as the shadows seemed to shift and dance. Somewhere in the darkness, a door clicked shut, and footsteps echoed down the corridor. Eleanor pulled the covers tight around her shoulders, her mind racing with questions. What secrets did this place hold? What had happened to the girls who had vanished before her? And what, exactly, was she meant to become within these walls? Outside, the city's lights flickered in the mist, and the bell tower tolled midnight. In the heart of London, beneath the veneer of respectability, something ancient and hungry stirred. St. Cecilia's boarding school for girls was waiting, and Eleanor Whitcombe, whether she knew it or not, had just stepped into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. Eleanor Whitcomb's first morning at St. Cecilia's began with the tolling of the bell at 5 o'clock, its iron voice reverberating through the stone corridors and into the marrow of her bones. She awoke in a narrow bed, the coarse wool, blanket scratchy against her skin, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memories of the previous night, the cold welcome, the silent supper, the oppressive hush came flooding back, and she sat up, heart pounding. The dormitory was a long, high-ceilinged room lined with identical beds. The other girls were already stirring, moving with practiced efficiency as they dressed in the school's drab uniforms: gray woolen skirts, white blouses, and black sashes. Eleanor's hands trembled as she buttoned her blouse, her fingers clumsy with nerves. She glanced around, searching for a friendly face, but the girls avoided her gaze, their eyes fixed on the floor or the task at hand. It was only when she reached the wash basin that she met her first companion, a girl with a wild tangle of red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose offered a tentative smile. "You're the new one, aren't you?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no staff were near. "I'm Alice Penrose." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the kindness. "Eleanor Whitcombe." "Don't worry," Alice interrupted, her voice low. "Everyone's scared their first day. Just keep your head down and do as you're told. It's easier that way." Before Eleanor could reply, a sharp voice cut through the room. No talking. It was Miss Hargreaves, the matron, her face pinched and severe. The girls fell silent, and Eleanor quickly finished washing, following the others down the corridor to the chapel. The chapel was a cold, echoing space, its stained glass windows casting fractured light across the stone floor. The girls filed into the pews, heads bowed, as Reverend Dr. Blackwood entered, his black robes billowing behind him. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing gray eyes and a voice that seemed to vibrate with authority. His sermons were less about comfort and more about penance, and as he spoke of sin and redemption, Eleanor felt a chill settle over her heart. After prayers, The girls were marched to the dining hall for a breakfast of thin porridge and stale bread. Conversation was forbidden, and the only sounds were the clatter of spoons and the occasional cough. Eleanor sat beside Alice, who managed a quick, reassuring wink before returning to her silent meal dot. As the days passed, Eleanor began to learn the rhythms of St. Cecilia's. There was Maggie Linton, a quiet, bookish girl with a limp, who spent her free time in the library, her nose buried in dusty tomes. Maggie rarely spoke, but when she did, her words were sharp and insightful. She had been at the school for 3 years, sent by an uncle after her parents died in a fire. She knew every secret passage and hidden alcove in the building, and she watched everything with wary, intelligent eyes. Then there was Beatrice B. Ashcroft, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, whose haughty demeanor masked a deep loneliness. B was the unofficial leader of the girls, her approval sought by all, her scorn feared. She had a talent for manipulation, and her alliances shifted like the London weather. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, Eleanor sensed a vulnerability, a fear of something she dared not name. Among the staff, Miss Grimshaw ruled with an iron fist, but it was Miss Hargreaves who enforced the daily discipline. She was everywhere at once, her footsteps echoing down the halls, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The girls whispered that she had once been a governess in a noble house, dismissed after a scandal no one dared discuss. Her punishments were swift and creative, and she seemed to take a particular interest in Eleanor, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Reverend Dr. Blackwood was a constant presence, his sermons growing more fervent with each passing week. He spoke of darkness and temptation, of the need for vigilance and sacrifice. The girls feared him, but some, like B, seemed to court his approval, attending extra lessons in scripture and music at his request. Eleanor's only real comfort was Alice, whose irrepressible spirit brought a measure of light to the gloom. Alice had been at St. Cecilia's for nearly 2 years, sent by her mother after a series of unladylike incidents. She was quick-witted and brave, unafraid to speak her mind when the staff were out of earshot. She took Eleanor under her wing, showing her the hidden corners of the school, the old laundry, the disused attic, the tiny garden behind the kitchens where wild violets grew. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Alice confided in Eleanor. "There's something wrong with this place," she whispered, her eyes darting to the shadowed windows. "Girls disappear, not just run away, vanish. And no one ever talks about it. If you ask, they say you're imagining things. But I know what I've seen." Eleanor shivered, the weight of Alice's words settling over her like a shroud. She thought of the locked doors, the strange noises at night, the way the staff seemed to watch them with hungry eyes. She remembered her father's warning, the shame that had driven her here, and wondered if she would ever be allowed to leave. As the weeks passed, Eleanor grew closer to Maggie, and even cautiously to B. She learned to navigate the school's treacherous social hierarchy, to avoid Miss Hargreaves' wrath, and to endure Reverend Blackwood's sermons. But the sense of unease never left her. She dreamed of shadows moving in the halls, of voices whispering her name, of hands reaching for her in the dark. One night, as she lay awake listening to the wind, she heard footsteps outside her door. She held her breath, heart pounding, as the handle turned and the door creaked open. A figure slipped inside a girl, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're coming. Please don't. Let them take me." Before Eleanor could respond, the girl was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The door clicked shut, and Eleanor was left alone, trembling with fear and questions. Who was the girl? What was she running from? And what, exactly, was the true nature of St. Cecilia's boarding school? As dawn broke over London, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just a student. She was a witness to something terrible, and she would have to find the courage to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. St. Cecilia's boarding school for girls was a world unto itself, a fortress of discipline and secrets set apart from the chaos of London. The building, constructed in the late Georgian style, but modified with Victorian severity, loomed over the narrow street like a watchful guardian. Its 4 stories were a maze of corridors, staircases, and hidden alcoves, each with its own history and purpose. The iron gates, always locked at dusk, marked the boundary between the world outside and the strange, insular life within. The main entrance opened into a grand foyer, its marble floor polished to a mirror shine. A sweeping staircase rose to the upper floors, flanked by portraits of benefactors and former headmistresses, their eyes following every visitor with silent judgment. The air was tinged with the scent of lavender polish and old paper, a mixture that seemed to seep into the very walls. To the left, a heavy oak door led to the headmistress's office, a place of both dread and hope for the girls summoned there. Beyond the foyer stretched the great hall, where meals were taken in strict silence. Long wooden tables, scarred by generations of use, filled the room from end to end. At the head table sat Miss Grimshaw and the senior staff, their presence a constant reminder of the school's rigid hierarchy. The windows, tall and arched, let in little light, their stained glass casting somber patterns on the stone floor. The girls ate quickly, eyes downcast, aware that any infraction could result in a summons to the punishment room. The heart of the school was the chapel, a cold, echoing space that dominated the ground floor. Its vaulted ceiling soared above rows of pews, and the altar was adorned with a single, unadorned cross. The stained glass windows depicted scenes of martyrdom and penance, their colors muted by decades of London soot. Here the girls gathered, for prayers at dawn and dusk, their voices rising in hymns that seemed to echo long after the service had ended. Reverend Dr. Blackwood presided over these rituals, his sermons a blend of fire and ice, promising salvation, but warning of damnation. For those who strayed, the dormitories occupied the upper floors, each room lined with narrow beds and simple wooden chests. The walls were bare, save for a single crucifix above each door. Privacy was a luxury the girls could not afford. Every movement was observed, every whisper noted. The staff patrolled the corridors at all hours, their footsteps a constant reminder that the girls were never truly alone. At night, the building seemed to settle into itself, the creaks and groans of old wood and stone mingling with the soft sighs of restless sleepers. The east wing was the oldest part of the school, its corridors narrower and its doors heavier. Here, the air was colder, and the windows were bricked over, allowing no light to penetrate. The girls were forbidden from entering this wing, and those who lingered too close to its doors were swiftly reprimanded. Rumors abounded about what lay beyond. Some said it was used for storage. Others whispered of secret rooms and hidden staircases. Alice claimed to have seen staff members disappear into the east wing late at night, their faces grim and determined. Beneath the school lay the cellars, a labyrinth of stone chambers and passageways that predated the building itself. The laundry, with its massive copper tubs and iron ringers, was located here, as was the boiler room, where Mr. Pritchard tended the ancient furnace. The cellars were damp and dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and coal. The girls were sent here, as punishment, forced to scrub floors or carry buckets of water up the steep stairs. Some claimed to have heard voices in the darkness, or seen shadows moving where no one should be. The school's public image was one of strict but benevolent reform. Brochures sent to prospective families spoke of academic excellence, moral instruction, and the transformation of wayward girls into model citizens. The curriculum was rigorous, with lessons in Latin, mathematics, music, and scripture. The staff, all women of impeccable reputation, were said to be devoted to the welfare of their charges. Inspections by the Board of Trustees were announced weeks in advance, and on those days, the school was scrubbed spotless, the girls dressed in their finest uniforms, and the staff all smiles and gentle words. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the reality was far harsher. Punishments were frequent and severe, ranging from extra chores to solitary confinement in the reflection room, a windowless cell in the east wing where girls were left alone for hours, sometimes days. The staff enforced silence with a zeal that bordered on fanaticism, and any sign of rebellion was swiftly crushed. The girls learned to communicate in whispers and glances, developing a secret language of survival. The school's benefactors, a shadowy group known only as the Board, visited rarely and always at night. Their carriages arrived in silence, and their meetings with Miss Grimshaw were conducted behind closed doors. The girls speculated endlessly about their identities. Some believed they were members of Parliament. Others thought they were wealthy widows or foreign dignitaries. What was certain was that their influence was immense, and their interest in the school went far beyond philanthropy. Eleanor soon realized that St. Cecilia's was a place of masks and mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed. The staff's smiles, hid sharp teeth, and the rules that governed daily life were designed not just to maintain order, but to instill fear and obedience. The building itself seemed complicit in the deception, its twisting corridors and hidden rooms creating a sense of disorientation and unease. One afternoon, as Eleanor helped Alice carry laundry to the cellars, she caught a glimpse of a door she had never seen before, heavy, iron-bound, and set deep into the stone wall. It was ajar, and for a moment she thought she saw movement within a flicker of white, a whisper of sound. But when she looked again, the door was closed, and Alice was tugging at her sleeve, urging her to hurry. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor tried to make sense of what she had seen. The school was full of secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. But as the wind howled outside and the shadows deepened, she wondered if some doors were better left unopened. Cecilia's boarding school for girls was a place of order and chaos, of light and darkness. It was a sanctuary and a prison, a place where innocence was both protected and destroyed. And as Eleanor would soon discover, its walls held horrors that no one, least of all the girls within, could ever have imagined. The days at St. Cecilia's passed in a rigid, unyielding rhythm, but beneath the surface, Eleanor sensed a current of unease that grew stronger with each passing week. The school's routines were designed to keep the girls busy and obedient. Yet the silence that pervaded every room was not the silence of peace, but of fear. It was as if the very stones of the building absorbed secrets, and at night, those secrets pressed in on Eleanor's dreams. It began with small things. Eleanor noticed that certain girls, once lively and outspoken, became withdrawn and pale, their eyes hollow and voices barely above a whisper. Maggie, ever observant, pointed out that these changes always followed a visit to the headmistress's office or a late-night summons by Miss Hargreaves. "They come back different," Maggie whispered one evening as they sat in the library, pretending to study Latin. "It's like something's been taken from them." Alice, too, had her suspicions. She told Eleanor about the night sisters, staff members, who patrolled the dormitories after midnight, their faces hidden behind white veils. "They say it's for our protection," Alice said, her voice trembling, "but I've seen them take girls away. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." Eleanor tried to dismiss these stories as the product of overactive imaginations, but she could not ignore the evidence mounting around her. One night, she awoke to the sound of muffled sobbing. She slipped from her bed and crept down the corridor, careful not to wake the others. The sound led her to the end of the hall, where she found Beatrice Ashcroft huddled against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. "Bee?" Eleanor whispered, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" Bee's eyes were red and swollen, her hands shaking. "They took Clara," she choked out. "She was here last night, and now her bed is empty. No one will say where she's gone. They just erased her." Eleanor wrapped her arms around Bee, offering what comfort she could. The next morning, Clara's belongings were gone, her name scratched from the dormitory roster. When Eleanor asked Miss Hargreaves about her, the matron's lips thinned. Clara was transferred to another institution. That is all you need to know. But Eleanor did not believe her. She began to watch the staff more closely, noting the way they whispered together in the corridors, the way their eyes lingered on certain girls. She saw Reverend Blackwood speaking in hushed tones with Miss Grimshaw, their faces grave. She overheard snatches of conversation. The East Wing, not ready. The board must be informed. It made her blood run cold. The atmosphere in the school grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The girls became more fearful, their laughter fading to nervous giggles, their conversations reduced to hurried whispers. Punishments grew harsher. Maggie spent 2 days in the reflection room for speaking out of turn, returning pale and silent, her hands trembling. Alice was caught sneaking into the cellars and was forbidden from seeing Eleanor for a week. One evening, as Eleanor sat alone in the garden, she saw a figure moving near the East Wing. It was Miss Grimshaw, carrying a lantern, her face set in grim determination. She disappeared through a door Eleanor had never noticed before, and moments later, a faint scream echoed through the night, quickly stifled. Eleanor's heart pounded. As she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, willing herself to become invisible. The next day, the school was abuzz with rumors. Some said a girl had tried to escape and been caught. Others whispered of a secret punishment chamber in the East Wing. Eleanor tried to question Alice, but her friend only shook her head. "Don't ask, Ellie. It's safer if you don't know." But Eleanor could not let it go. That night she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling, the wind rattling the windows, the distant tolling of the bell. She thought of Clara, of the other girls who had vanished, of the fear in Bee's eyes. She resolved to find out the truth, no matter the risk. Her opportunity came sooner than she expected. A week later, Maggie slipped her a note during breakfast. "Meet me in the library after lights out. I've found something." Eleanor's heart raced as she endured the rest of the day, her mind spinning with possibilities. That night, she crept from her bed and made her way to the library, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Maggie was waiting, her face pale but determined. She led Eleanor to a hidden alcove behind the shelves, where she produced a battered journal. "I found this in the old laundry," Maggie whispered. "It belonged to a girl named Lillian. She wrote about the East Wing, about strange rituals, about girls being taken at night. She said there's a room down there, a room where they do things that change you." Eleanor's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading Lillian's desperate scrawl. The entries spoke of fear, of pain, of a darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls. The last entry was a single trembling line. "If I disappear, tell someone. Don't let them win." Eleanor closed the journal, her resolve hardening. She looked at Maggie, who nodded grimly. "We have to find out what's happening," Maggie said. "We have to help the others." As they slipped back to their dormitory, Eleanor felt a new sense of purpose. The darkness at St. Cecilia's was real, and it was growing. But she was no longer alone. Together, she and her friends would uncover the truth, whatever the cost. That night, as the wind howled and the shadows deepened, Eleanor knew that the first signs of darkness had become impossible to ignore. The true horror of St. Cecilia's was only beginning to reveal itself, and she was determined to face it head-on. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a sense of dread and determination. The journal Maggie had found weighed heavily in her mind, its pages filled with the desperate words of a girl who had vanished without a trace. As she dressed, she glanced around the dormitory, her eyes lingering on the empty beds, silent reminders of those who had disappeared. She wondered how many stories, like Lillian's, had been erased from St. Cecilia's, how many voices had been silenced by fear. At breakfast, the atmosphere was tense. The girls ate in silence, their eyes darting nervously toward the staff table. Eleanor caught Alice's gaze and gave a subtle nod, signaling that she needed to talk. After the meal, the girls filed out to their lessons, but Eleanor managed to slip away, meeting Alice and Maggie in the small, overgrown garden behind the kitchens. "We need to know more," Eleanor whispered, glancing over her shoulder to Meg. Sure, they were alone. "We need to find the others, those who've seen what happens in the East Wing, or who've lost someone." Alice nodded, her jaw set. "There's one girl who might help. Her name is Ruth. She's been here longer than anyone, almost 5 years. They say she's mad, but I think she knows more than she lets on." Maggie agreed. "Ruth keeps to herself, but I've seen her watching the staff. She's clever, and she's survived things that would have broken anyone else." That afternoon, during free study, the 3 girls approached Ruth. She sat alone in the library's darkest corner, her hair unkempt, her eyes shadowed and wary. At first, she ignored them, her fingers tracing patterns on the warm tabletop. But when Eleanor mentioned Lillian's name, Ruth's head snapped up, her gaze sharp and haunted. "Lillian was my friend," Ruth said quietly. "They took her last winter. She tried to fight, but it didn't matter. No one ever comes back from the East Wing." Eleanor leaned in, her voice gentle. "What happens there, Ruth?" "Please, we want to help." Ruth hesitated, glancing around. "To make sure they were alone. They call it the cleansing. They say it's for our own good, to rid us of sin. But it's not about salvation. It's about control. They break you, piece by piece, until you're nothing but a shell. Some girls, they don't survive. Others come back, but they're never the same." She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I saw what they did to Lillian. I saw the marks on her arms, the way she screamed at night. And then one morning, she was gone. They said she'd been sent home, but I knew it was a lie." Alice reached out, squeezing Ruth's hand. "We're going to stop them, but we need your help. Will you show us where they take the girls?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I'll try. But you have to be careful. They're always watching. Over thee." Next few days, the girls gathered more stories. There was Sarah, a quiet girl from the countryside, who had been sent to St. Cecilia's after her parents died. She spoke of waking in the night to find her roommate missing, her bed cold and empty. "They said she ran away," Sarah whispered, "but she left her shoes behind. No one runs barefoot in this place." Then there was Mary, a former favorite of Miss Grimshaw, who had once been lively and quick-witted. Now she moved through the halls like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her laughter gone. Maggie managed to coax a few words from her, and what she heard chilled her to the bone. "They took me to the East Wing," Mary murmured, her voice flat. "They made me confess things I never did. They hurt me until I couldn't remember my own name. When they were done, they said I was cleansed. But I don't feel clean. I feel empty." The more stories they heard, the clearer the pattern became. The staff targeted girls who were vulnerable, those without family, those who questioned authority, those who dared to speak out. The punishments were always justified as discipline or reform, but the true purpose was to break the girls' spirits, to make them obedient and compliant. Eleanor's anger grew with each new revelation. She saw the toll it took on her friends Alice's. Defiance tempered by fear, Maggie's sharp mind dulled by exhaustion, Ruth's haunted eyes. She realized that the victims were not just those who vanished, but all the girls who lived in constant terror, who learned to hide their true selves to survive. One evening, as the sun set behind the school's spires, Eleanor gathered her friends. In the garden. "We can't let this continue," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have to do something. We have to find proof, something that will force the outside world to see what's happening here." Alice nodded, her eyes blazing. "We'll get into the East Wing. We'll find out what they're hiding." Maggie produced a small rusted key. "I found this in the laundry. I think it opens one of the doors in the East Wing." Ruth looked at each of them in turn, her expression grave. "If we do this, there's no going back. They'll come for us if they find out." Eleanor took Ruth's hand, her resolve unshakable. "Then we'll stick together. We'll protect each other. And we'll make sure no more girls have to suffer in silence." As darkness fell over St. Cecilia's, the four girls made a pact, promised to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. They were no longer just victims. They were survivors, and they would fight for justice, for Lillian, for Clara, for all the girls whose stories had been stolen. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she felt a flicker of hope amid the fear. For the first time since arriving at St. Cecilia's, she believed that change was possible. The victims' stories would not be forgotten. Their voices would be heard, and the horrors hidden within the school's walls would finally be brought to light. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and planning. Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth moved through St. Cecilia's with new purpose, their eyes sharper, their whispers more urgent. The school's routines, once merely oppressive, now seemed designed to suffocate any spark of resistance. Every rule, every ritual, every glance from the staff was a thread in a web meant to ensnare and silence. The girls met in secret, using the garden, the laundry, and the library's hidden alcove as their sanctuaries. They mapped out the school's layout as best they could, piecing together rumors and memories. Maggie's key became their talisman, a symbol of hope and danger. They knew the risk. Discovery meant punishment, perhaps even disappearance. But the stories they had gathered, the broken girls, the vanished friends demanded action. It was Ruth who explained the system most clearly. "They watch us all the time," she whispered one evening as the four huddled in the garden, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and violets. "Every staff member has a role. Miss Grimshaw is the head, but it's Miss Hargreaves who enforces the rules. The night sisters patrol after dark, and Reverend Blackwood, he decides who needs cleansing." Alice shuddered. "What does that even mean? Cleansing?" Ruth's eyes were haunted. "It's not just punishment. It's breaking you. They take you to the East Wing, make you confess to things you never did. They keep you awake for days, starve you, hurt you. They say it's for your soul, but it's really about control. When you come back, you're not the same." Some girls never come back at all. The girls began to notice the patterns. The staff kept meticulous records: who was obedient, who was rebellious, who had family that visited, who was utterly alone. Those with no one to protect them were most at risk. The punishments were tailored to each girl's fears: isolation for the sociable, public humiliation for the proud, physical pain for the defiant. The staff used scripture as a weapon, twisting words of faith into tools of shame and submission. Meals or another form of control. The food was bland and meager, just enough to keep the girls weak and compliant. Any infraction speaking out of turn, failing to recite a prayer, even a misplaced glance meant a skipped meal or extra chores. The girls learned to hide their hunger, to hoard crumbs, to share what little they had with those who suffered most. The reflection room was the staff's favorite threat. It was a small, windowless cell in the east wing, its walls bare and cold. Girls sent there emerged pale and trembling, their eyes hollow. Some whispered of voices in the dark, of hands that reached for them when the lights went out. Others refused to speak of it at all. But the true heart of the system was fear. The staff cultivated it carefully, using rumors and half-truths to keep the girls divided and suspicious. They encouraged informants, rewarding those who reported on their peers. Trust was dangerous. Friendship, a liability. The girls learned to guard their words, to mask their emotions, to survive by becoming invisible. Yet, even in this climate of terror, small acts of rebellion persisted. Eleanor saw it in the way Alice smuggled wildflowers into the dormitory, in the secret notes Maggie passed during lessons, in the way Ruth watched the staff with quiet defiance. These acts were tiny flames in the darkness, reminders that the system was not infallible. One night, the girls put their plan into action. Maggie had discovered that the night sisters changed shifts at midnight, leaving a brief window when the east wing was unguarded. Armed with the rusted key, they crept through the silent halls, hearts pounding. The door to the east wing groaned, open, revealing a corridor colder and darker than any they had known. They moved quickly, guided by Ruth's memory and Maggie's map. The walls were lined with doors, some locked, others ajar. From behind one, they heard muffled sobs. Alice reached for the handle, but Ruth shook her head. We can't help them now. We have to find proof. At the end of the corridor, they found a heavy door marked Sanctuary. The key fit the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a room that was both chapel and prison. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was stained with old blood. A table in the center held a ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes, cleansed, transferred, erased. Maggie snapped photographs with a small camera she had stolen from the art room, her hands shaking. Eleanor rifled through the ledger, her eyes widening as she recognized names Lillian, Clara, Mary. The evidence was undeniable. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the corridor. The girls froze, hearts racing. The door creaked open, and Miss Hargreaves stepped inside, her face twisted with fury. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. For a moment, time stood still. Then Alice lunged, knocking the ledger from the table. Maggie grabbed the camera, and Ruth pulled Eleanor toward the door. They ran, the sound of Miss Hargreaves' shouts ringing in their ears. They made it back to the dormitory, breathless and terrified. The evidence was hidden, the camera and ledger stashed beneath a loose floorboard. But they knew the staff would not rest until they found the intruders. That night, as Eleanor lay awake, she realized the true nature of the system that ruled St. Cecilia's. It was not just a school, but a machine built to crush hope and erase identity. But now, for the first time, the machine had been challenged. The girls had seen the heart of the darkness, and they would not stop until it was destroyed. The morning after their daring incursion into the East Wing, the atmosphere at St. Cecilia's was electric with tension. The staff moved through the halls with sharpened vigilance, their eyes scanning every face, their voices clipped and cold. Miss Hargreaves prowled the corridors like a wounded animal, her anger barely contained. The girls sensed that something had shifted, that the invisible boundaries of their world had been breached. Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth kept their heads down, careful not to draw attention. They met only in passing, exchanging brief glances and coded words. The camera and ledger, their precious evidence, remained hidden beneath the dormitory floorboards. Every moment was fraught with danger. A single misstep could mean discovery and ruin. But as the days passed, Eleanor began to see the larger web that held St. Cecilia's in its grip. The school was not an isolated institution, but the center of a network that stretched far beyond its iron gates. The board of trustees, whose names were never spoken aloud, visited more frequently now, their carriages arriving under cover of darkness. Eleanor watched from her window as shadowy figures entered the headmistress's office, their faces obscured by hats and veils. She wondered what secrets were exchanged behind those closed doors, what bargains were struck to keep the school's horrors hidden. It was Maggie who first uncovered the connection to the outside world. In the library, she found a stack of letters, addressed to Miss Grimshaw, their seals unbroken. With trembling hands, she slipped one into her pocket and later, in the safety of the garden, read it aloud to the others. The letter was from a prominent London magistrate, thanking Miss Grimshaw for her discreet handling of a troublesome ward. He praised the school's methods of reform and hinted at a generous donation to ensure continued cooperation. The implication was clear. St. Cecilia's was a dumping ground for inconvenient girls, a place where the city's elite could send their problems to be erased. Alice's eyes flashed with anger. They're all in on it. The judges, the police, the church, they know what's happening here, and they don't care. As long as we stay quiet, as long as we disappear, they get what they want. Ruth nodded grimly. It's not just the staff. The board is made up of powerful people, politicians, businessmen, even clergy. They protect the school because it serves their interests, and anyone who tries to expose them vanishes. The girls realized that their fight was not just against Miss Grimshaw and her staff, but against an entire system built on secrecy and complicity. The punishments, the disappearances, the cleansings, all were sanctioned by those in power, justified as necessary for the greater good. Eleanor's resolve hardened. We have to get the evidence out. If we can get the ledger and the photographs to someone outside the school, someone who isn't part of the network, maybe we can force them to act. But finding an ally was easier said than done. The local constable, Mr. Finch, was a frequent visitor to the school, his pockets lined with bribes. The parish priest, Father Dunn, preached obedience and discipline, his sermons echoing Reverend Blackwood's warnings about the dangers of rebellion. Even the girls' families, those who still cared, were kept at arm's length, their letters censored, and their visits supervised. It was Ruth who suggested a possible contact. There's a woman who comes to the kitchen every fortnight, Mrs. Harper. She brings bread and milk from the orphanage. She's kind, and she listens. If anyone would believe us, it's her. The plan was risky, but it was their only hope. On the next delivery day, Eleanor slipped away from her chores and found Mrs. Harper in the kitchen, her arms full of loaves. With a trembling voice, Eleanor told her everything: the punishments, the disappearances, the evidence they had found. Mrs. Harper's face grew pale as she listened. I've heard rumors, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. But I never imagined, my dear, you must be careful. These people are dangerous, but I will help you. I promise. That night, the girls retrieved the camera and ledger, wrapping them in a cloth and hiding them in a basket of bread. Mrs. Harper smuggled them out of the school, her heart pounding with fear. She promised to take them to a journalist she trusted, a woman named Miss Lydia Fairchild, who had exposed corruption in the city before. But the network was not so easily outwitted. The next day, the school was thrown into chaos. Miss Grimshaw announced a surprise inspection, and the staff tore through the dormitories, searching for contraband. The girls' belongings were appended, their letters confiscated, their secret hiding places discovered and destroyed. Miss Hargreaves interrogated them one by one, her questions sharp and relentless. Eleanor held her breath, praying that Mrs. Harper had escaped undetected. She endured the search, the accusations, the threats. But in her heart, she clung to hope, the hope that their story would finally reach the outside world, that the network of corruption would be exposed. As night fell, the girls gathered in the garden, their faces drawn but determined. "We've done all we can," Maggie whispered. "Now we wait." The wind rustled the ivy on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled midnight. The network that had protected St. Cecilia's for so long was beginning to unravel. And for the first time, the girls dared to believe that justice might be possible. The days that followed were a study in dread. The staff's suspicion was a living thing, coiling through the halls, tightening around the girls like a noose. Miss Grimshaw's eyes seemed to bore through Eleanor whenever they met, and Miss Hargreaves. Footsteps echoed with new menace. The girls clung to hope, but the waiting gnawed at their nerves. Every time the bell rang, every time a door creaked open, Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. That it was Alice who first sensed the storm about to break. She found Eleanor in the garden, her face pale, her hands trembling. "They know, Ellie. I heard Miss Hargreaves talking to Reverend Blackwood. They're planning something. I think they suspect us." Eleanor's mind raced. "Do you think Mrs. Harper got away? What if they caught her?" Alice shook her head. "I don't know. But we have to be ready. If they come for us," she didn't finish. The fear in her eyes said enough. That night, the school was quieter than usual. The girls huddled in their beds, whispering prayers into the darkness. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows, her thoughts a tangle of dread and defiance. She thought of Lillian, of Clara, of all the girls who had vanished. She thought of the ledger and the photographs, now in the hands of strangers. Would it be enough? The answer came with the dawn. Before the first bell, the dormitory doors burst open. Miss Hargreaves and two night sisters strode in, their faces grim. Eleanor Whitcombe, Alice Penrose, Margaret Linton, Ruth Carter, "Come with us." Now. The other girls shrank back, eyes wide with terror. Eleanor's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to stand. She glanced at Alice, who gave her a brave, trembling smile. Maggie and Ruth joined them, their faces pale but resolute. They were marched through the silent halls, past the chapel, past the great hall, to the east wing. The door groaned open, and the cold, damp air hit them like a slap. Miss Grimshaw waited inside, her expression unreadable. "You have been found in possession of forbidden items," she intoned. "You have conspired to undermine the authority of this institution. Such rebellion cannot go unpunished." Eleanor's voice shook, but she met the headmistress's gaze. "We only wanted the truth. We only wanted to help the girls you've hurt." Miss Grimshaw's eyes narrowed. "You know nothing of what is necessary here. Discipline is mercy. Order is salvation. Without us, you would be lost." The girls were separated, each taken to a different cell. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of cold, hunger, and fear. Eleanor lost track of time. She recited prayers, clung to memories of her friends, tried to hold on to hope. But the darkness pressed in, whispering that she had failed, that all their efforts had been for nothing. But outside the school's walls, the world was changing. Mrs. Harper had reached Miss Fairchild, the journalist, and the evidence was already in her hands. The photographs, the ledger, the stories proof of the horrors at St. Cecilia's. Miss Fairchild wasted no time. She contacted the authorities, wrote a scathing article for the London Gazette, and rallied a group of reformers to demand an investigation. The news spread like wildfire. By the third day of the girls' imprisonment, the school was surrounded by constables, journalists, and angry parents. The board of trustees tried to intervene, but the tide had turned. The city's eyes were on St. Cecilia's, and the truth could no longer be hidden. Inside her cell, Eleanor heard the commotion shouts, footsteps, the crash of doors being forced open. She pressed her ear to the wall, her heart pounding. Was it real, or just another cruel trick? The door to her cell burst open, and a constable appeared, lantern in hand. "Miss Whitcombe, you're safe now. Come with me." Eleanor stumbled into the corridor, blinking in the sudden light. She saw Alice, Maggie, and Ruth, all pale and shaken but alive. They embraced, tears streaming down their faces. The staff were rounded up, their protests drowned out by the clamor of the crowd. Miss Grimshaw was led away in handcuffs, her composure finally broken. Miss Hargreaves screamed curses at the constables, her mask of control shattered. Reverend Blackwood tried to flee, but was caught at the gates, his black robes flapping like the wings of a trapped crow. The girls were taken to the great hall, where doctors and reformers tended to their wounds. Parents arrived, some weeping. With relief, others with guilt for having sent their daughters to such a place. Eleanor watched as the walls of St. Cecilia's, once so imposing, seemed to shrink in the face of truth. But the victory was bittersweet. Not all the girls could be found. Some, like Lillian and Clara, remained missing, their fates unknown. The scars, physical and emotional, would take years to heal. As the sun set over London, Eleanor sat with her friends in the garden, the air filled with the scent of violets and hope. They had survived the breaking point. They had faced the darkness and brought it into the light. But the story of St. Cecilia's was not yet over. The reckoning had only just begun. The days following the rescue were a whirlwind of questions, revelations, and reckoning. St. Cecilia's, once a fortress of silence, was now a hive of activity. Constables patrolled the halls, their boots echoing on the stone floors. Journalists scribbled notes in the garden, their eyes wide with horror as they listened to the girls' stories. Doctors moved from dormitory to dormitory, tending to wounds both visible and hidden. The school's iron gates, once a symbol of confinement, now stood open to the world. Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth found themselves at the center of the storm. They were interviewed by investigators, reformers, and even members of Parliament. Each time they told their story, the punishments, the disappearances, the ledger and photographs, the night they broke into the East Wing. Their words were met with disbelief, then outrage, then grim determination. The investigation was led by Inspector Jonathan Hawley, a tall, sharp-eyed man with a reputation for rooting out corruption. He listened intently to the girls, his notebook filling with details. "You've shown remarkable courage," he told Eleanor after her first interview. "But we need more than stories. We need proof, something that will stand up in court." Maggie produced the camera and the ledger, which Mrs. Harper had returned to them after the authorities arrived. Inspector Hall examined the photographs, his face growing graver with each image. The ledger, with its careful records of punishments, transfers, and cleansings, was damning. Names, dates, and cryptic notes painted a picture of systematic abuse. The search of the school began in earnest. The constables, guided by Ruth's memory and Maggie's map, scoured the East Wing and the cellars. They found the reflection room, its walls scarred by years of suffering. They found hidden compartments in the headmistress's office, filled with letters from powerful men judges, politicians, clergy thanking Miss Grimshaw for her discretion. In the cellars, they discovered a locked room containing personal belongings of missing girls, shoes, ribbons, diaries, and most chillingly, a stack of letters never sent. The most damning discovery came when a loose stone in the East Wing corridor revealed a hidden passage. The air inside was cold and stale, thick with the scent of mildew and fear. At the end of the passage, the investigators found a small, windowless chamber. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was stained dark. In one corner, A pile of tattered uniforms and broken shoes told the story of those who had never returned. Inspector Halle called for silence as the chamber was documented. "This," he said, his voice heavy, "is the heart of their cruelty. This is what they tried to hide." The press seized on every detail. The London Gazette published Miss Fairchild's expose, complete with photographs and excerpts from the ledger. Headlines screamed of horrors at St. Cecilia's, boarding school of nightmares, and the sinister truth unveiled. The public was outraged. Parents demanded answers. Reformers called for sweeping changes to the laws governing such institutions. The Board of Trustees, once untouchable, was summoned to testify. Some denied any knowledge of the abuses, claiming they had trusted Miss Grimshaw and her staff. Others, confronted with the letters and financial records, broke down and confessed to their complicity. The magistrate who had written to Miss Grimshaw was arrested, as were several other prominent figures. The network of corruption, so carefully constructed, began to unravel. The staff of St. Cecilia's faced their own reckoning. Miss Grimshaw, her composure shattered, confessed to many of the charges, but insisted she had acted for the good of the girls. Miss Hargreaves was defiant, blaming the board and the parents for abandoning their daughters. Reverend Blackwood, stripped of his clerical collar, wept as he was led away in chains. For the girls, the investigation was both a relief and a torment. They were free, but the memories of what they had endured lingered. Some, like Mary and Sarah, struggled to speak of their experiences. Others, like Beatrice, found strength in their anger, vowing to fight for justice. Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth became symbols of resistance, their names whispered with admiration and gratitude. One afternoon, as the investigation wound down, Inspector Halle gathered the four friends in the garden. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "Because of you, this place will never hurt anyone again. But there are still questions to answer. Some of the missing girls have not been found. We may never know the full extent of what happened here." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy. "We did what we could. For Lillian, for Clara, for all of them." Halle smiled gently. "You did more than anyone could have asked. You gave them a voice." As the sun set over the battered walls of St. Cecilia's, the girls sat together, their hands entwined. The investigation had brought the truth into the light, but the scars would remain. Still, they had a hope that the world would remember, that justice would be done, and that no more girls would suffer in silence. The discovery of the horrors within St. Cecilia's had shaken London to its core, but it had also sparked a movement, a demand for change, for accountability, for compassion. The girls who had survived became the first witnesses in a new era, their courage lighting the way for others to follow. The trial of St. Cecilia's boarding school became the most talked about event in London. The courthouse was packed every day, with crowds spilling into the streets, eager for news of the proceedings. The city's newspapers ran daily updates, and the names of Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth became known across England as the brave girls who had brought down a house of horrors. The prosecution, led by Inspector Hall and a team of reform-minded lawyers, presented the evidence with meticulous care. The photographs, the ledger, the hidden chamber, and the testimonies of the girls painted a picture of systematic cruelty and corruption. The courtroom was often silent, except for the voices of the survivors, their words trembling but clear as they recounted the punishments, the disappearances, and the terror that had ruled their lives. Miss Grimshaw sat in the dock, her once imposing figure diminished, her eyes hollow. She listened as girl after girl described the cleansings, the reflection room, the threats and violence. When her turn to speak came, she tried to justify her actions. "I did what was necessary," she insisted, her voice brittle. "These girls were wild, broken. I gave them order, purpose. Without discipline, they would have been lost. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, was unmoved. Discipline is not cruelty, Miss Grimshaw. Order is not terror. You abused your power and destroyed lives. The law will not excuse you. Miss Hargreaves was equally unrepentant. She blamed the board, the parents, even the girls themselves. They were troublemakers, she spat. They needed to be taught a lesson. I only did what was expected of me. Reverend Blackwood, stripped of his clerical collar and dignity, wept openly as the evidence was read. He confessed to his role in the punishments, the sermons that twisted Scripture into a weapon. I lost my way, he sobbed. I thought I was saving souls, but I was only serving my own pride. The Board of Trustees faced their own reckoning. Some members, confronted with letters and financial records, confessed to accepting bribes and turning a blind eye to the abuses. Others tried to claim ignorance, but the evidence was overwhelming. The magistrate who had written to Miss Grimshaw was sentenced to prison, as were several other prominent figures. The network of corruption that had protected St. Cecilia's for so long was finally exposed and dismantled. For the girls, the trial was both catharsis and agony. They relived their worst memories on the witness stand, but they also saw justice done. The public, once skeptical, now rallied to their side. Donations poured in for the survivors, and reformers used the case to demand new laws protecting children in institutions. Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth were celebrated as heroes, but they struggled with the weight of their experiences. Eleanor found herself haunted by dreams of the East Wing, of Lillian and Clara, of the girls who had not survived. Alice, once so bold, sometimes flinched at sudden noises or harsh words. Maggie threw herself into her studies, determined to become a lawyer and fight for others. Ruth, quiet and watchful, became an advocate for girls in orphanages, visiting institutions to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had. The government responded with sweeping reforms. New laws required regular inspections of all boarding, schools and orphanages. Staff were vetted and trained, and children were given the right to speak to inspectors in private. The St. Cecilia's Act, as it became known, set a new standard for the care and protection of vulnerable children. Across the country, the building that had housed St. Cecilia's was closed and boarded up. For months, it stood as a grim reminder of what had happened within its walls. Eventually, the city decided to demolish it, and in its place, a small park was created, a place of peace and remembrance. A plaque was erected at the entrance, bearing the names of the girls who had vanished, and a simple inscription, in memory of those who suffered and in honor of those who spoke the truth. On the day the park was dedicated, Eleanor, Alice, Maggie, and Ruth stood together beneath the spring sun. They laid flowers at the base of the plaque, their hands entwined. Around them, families picnicked, children played, and the city moved on. But for the four friends, the past was never far away. We did it, Alice whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. We stopped them. Eleanor nodded, tears in her eyes. We did. For Lillian, for Clara, for all of us. Maggie squeezed their hands. We'll never forget, and we'll never let it happen again. Ruth looked up at the sky, her face calm. We survived. That's our justice. As the sun set over the new park, the girls stood in silence, remembering the darkness they had faced and the light they had brought into the world. Justice had been served, but the scars would remain a reminder of the price of silence and the power of truth. Years passed, and the story of St. Cecilia's boarding school became legend, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms, recounted in newspapers, and studied by reformers and lawmakers. The park that replaced the old building grew lush and green, its trees shading benches where children played and elders sat in quiet contemplation. The plaque at its entrance, weathered by rain and sun, remained a silent sentinel, ensuring that the memory of what had happened there would never fade. Eleanor. Alice, Maggie, and Ruth each forged their own paths, but the bond they shared endured. Their lives were forever marked by the horrors they had survived, but also by the courage they had found in one another. Eleanor, once a frightened girl sent away in disgrace, became a writer. Her memoir, Beneath the Bell Tower, was published. To great acclaim, its pages filled with the voices of the lost and the lessons learned in darkness. She traveled the country, speaking at schools and conferences, urging vigilance and compassion for the vulnerable. Alice, whose laughter had once been the brightest light in the dormitory, found her calling as a teacher. She worked in the poorest neighborhoods of London, determined to give every child the safety and kindness she had once been denied. Her classroom was a place of warmth and acceptance, and her students adored her. Yet in quiet moments, she still felt the old fear, the shadow of St. Cecilia's never fully leaving her heart. Maggie, true to her promise, became a lawyer. She fought tirelessly for children's rights, her sharp mind and unyielding spirit earning her respect in the courts and Parliament alike. She helped draft new laws, ensuring that no institution could ever again operate in secrecy and cruelty. Her work was her tribute to the girls who had not survived, her way of turning pain into purpose. Ruth, the quietest of the four, became a social worker. She visited orphanages and schools across England, her gentle presence a comfort to frightened children. She listened to their stories, believed them, and made sure their voices were heard. Ruth never married, but her life was rich with meaning. Her days spent protecting those who could not protect themselves. The legacy of St. Cecilia's was not just in the laws that changed or the park that bloomed where the school once stood. It was in the way people spoke of children, in the questions they asked, in the vigilance that became part of the nation's conscience. The phrase, "Remember St. Cecilia's," became a rallying cry for reformers, a warning to those in power, and a promise to every child that they would not be forgotten. Yet, for all the progress, some mysteries remained. The fates of Lillian, Clara, and other missing girls were never fully uncovered. Their names were etched on the park's plaque, their stories woven into the fabric of the city's memory. On the anniversary of the school's closure, families gathered in the park, laying flowers and lighting candles. Survivors spoke, their voices trembling but strong, reminding the world that evil thrives in silence, and that justice is a flame that must be tended. Year after year, Eleanor often returned to the park, sitting beneath the old oak tree that had once stood outside the school's walls. She watched children play, their laughter ringing through the air, and felt a bittersweet peace. She knew that the scars she carried would never fully heal, but she also knew that she had helped build something better, a world where secrets could not so easily be buried, where the vulnerable had champions, and where the truth, once revealed, could never be silenced again. On one such visit, as dusk settled over the city, Eleanor was joined by Alice, Maggie, and Ruth. They sat together in the fading light, their hands entwined as they had been on that day so many years before. They spoke of the past, of the friends they had lost, of the lives they had built. They laughed, they wept, and they remembered Dot as the first stars appeared above London. Eleanor looked at her friends and felt a quiet certainty. "We were just girls," she said softly, "but we changed the world." Maggie smiled, her eyes shining. "We did, and we'll keep changing it, as long as we remember." Alice squeezed their hands. "For Lillian, for Clara, for all of us." Ruth nodded, her voice a whisper on the evening breeze. "For every child who needs us." The park was quiet, the city's noise softened by distance and memory. The legacy of St. Cecilia's lived on, not in fear, but in hope, in vigilance, and in the unbreakable bond of those who had survived. The horrors of the past would never be forgotten, but neither would the courage that had brought them to light. And so, beneath the stars, the four friends sat together, guardians of a story that would echo through generations, a story of darkness, faced of truth revealed, and of a world forever changed by the bravery of a few determined girls.